The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Windsor Castle as the changing of the guard ceremony began. Tourists lined the gates with cameras ready, excited to witness one of Britain's most famous traditions. The red-coated guard stood perfectly still, their tall black hats creating an imposing silhouette against the ancient stone walls. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary ceremony. Hidden among the crowd of onlookers was someone very special, 8-year-old Prince George, third in line to the throne. He wasn't supposed to be there at all. The young prince had slipped away from his morning lessons with his private tutor. While everyone thought he was safely tucked away in the castle's schoolroom, practicing his French vocabulary, George had other plans. He had been watching the guard ceremonies from his bedroom window for months, fascinated by the precision and pageantry. Today, his curiosity finally got the better of him. Dressed in simple clothes that any tourist's child might wear, dark jeans, a navy sweater, and trainers, George blended perfectly with the crowd. His security detail had no idea he had wandered off. The castle staff assumed he was with his bodyguards. It was a perfect storm of miscommunication that allowed the future king to experience something most royals never could, being truly anonymous in a crowd. As George squeezed between the tourists, trying to get a better view, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the guards standing at attention near the main gate was swaying slightly. At first, George thought it might be the wind moving the man's tall bearskin hat. But as he watched more carefully, he realized the guard's face was pale and beaded with sweat. The ceremony continued around them. The band played their traditional marches while hundreds of tourists snapped photos. Nobody else seemed to notice what George was seeing. The guard was clearly unwell, but the rigid training of the Queen's Guard meant he would never break formation or ask for help. These soldiers were taught to stand perfectly, still no matter what happened, even if they felt faint or sick. George had heard stories from his grandfather about guards who had collapsed during ceremonies but never moved until they hit the ground. It was part of their legendary discipline. But watching it happen in real life, seeing a real person struggling, was different from hearing tales of military tradition. The guard's swaying became more pronounced. George could see the man's knees beginning to buckle slightly. In just moments, the soldier would likely collapse in front of hundreds of tourists and television cameras. The embarrassment would be enormous, and more importantly, the man might seriously hurt himself falling in full ceremonial dress onto the stone courtyard. George felt his heart racing. He knew he should probably find an adult, maybe run back to the castle and alert someone, but there wasn't time. The ceremony was in full swing, and the guard looked like he might fall at any second. The young prince realized that sometimes being royal meant taking action, even when you weren't supposed to be where you were. Looking around quickly, George spotted exactly what he needed. Near the edge of the crowd, a maintenance worker had left a small orange traffic cone, probably from some minor repair work earlier that morning. Without thinking twice, George darted over and grabbed it. What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in recent royal history, though very few people would ever know the real story behind it. The young prince was about to make a decision that would save a guard's dignity and possibly prevent a serious injury. But it would also create a mystery that would puzzle royal watchers and military officials for years to come. As George clutched the orange cone and looked back at the swaying guard, he took a deep breath. He was about to break about a dozen royal protocols and probably get into the biggest trouble of his young life. But sometimes, he thought, doing the right thing was more important than following the rules. The ceremony music swelled around him as George prepared to act, knowing that in just a few seconds everything would change. With the orange traffic cone in his small hands, Prince George moved through the crowd like a boy on a mission. The tourists were so focused on photographing the ceremony that nobody paid attention to one more child weaving between them. George's heart pounded as he got closer to the guard formation. The sick guard was now visibly struggling. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool morning air, and his rifle seemed heavier in his grip. His fellow guards remained perfectly still beside him, trained never to break formation no matter what happened. The military discipline that made the Queen's Guard famous was about to become a serious problem. George knew he had to act fast, but he also knew he couldn't just walk up to the guard. That would cause chaos and probably get both of them in terrible trouble. The young prince needed to be clever about this. He had spent his whole life watching adults handle delicate situations with diplomacy and subtle signals. Now it was his turn to put those lessons into practice. Standing about 10 feet away from the guard formation, George carefully placed the orange cone on the ground. Then he did something that showed wisdom far beyond his 8 years. He gave the sick guard a very specific hand signal. It wasn't a random gesture. George had been studying military history with his tutors and had learned about the silent communication methods used by soldiers. The hand signal George used was simple but clear, a subtle pointing gesture toward the ground followed by a small beckoning motion. To anyone watching, it would look like a child playing or perhaps mimicking something he had seen on television, but to a trained military man who was feeling unwell, the message was unmistakable. There's a safe way out. The guard's eyes widened slightly when he saw the signal. For just a moment, his military training battled with his confusion. Who was this boy? How did he know military signals? And why was he trying to help? But as another wave of dizziness hit him, the guard realized he didn't have time to figure out the mystery. He was going to collapse, and soon. The orange cone that the boy had placed offered him something precious, a reason to move that wouldn't break protocol. In the Queen's Guard, there are very few acceptable reasons to leave formation during a ceremony. One of them is if there's a safety hazard that needs immediate attention. A traffic cone placed near the guard formation could certainly be considered such a hazard, especially if it might trip tourists or interfere with the ceremony. The guard made his decision. Using the precise controlled movements he had been trained to execute, he took 3 measured steps toward the orange cone. To the crowd, it looked like he was simply addressing a minor issue. Nobody suspected he was actually saving himself from collapsing in front of hundreds of people. As the guard bent down to move the cone, George was ready with the next part of his plan. He had positioned himself near a small alcove in the castle wall, a spot that was out of sight from most of the crowd and the television cameras. With another subtle gesture, he indicated that the guard should move toward this sheltered area. The guard understood immediately. Still carrying the orange cone as his excuse for being out of formation, he walked the few steps to where George was waiting. Once they were both hidden from view, the full impact of what had just happened hit both of them. The guard looked down at the small boy who had just saved him from a humiliating collapse. "Thank you, lad," he whispered, his voice shaky from both illness and amazement. "I don't know how you knew, but you just saved me from a right mess." George looked up at the tall soldier with his red coat and bearskin hat. For a moment, he felt very small and very young, but he also felt proud. He had seen someone in trouble and found a way to help without causing a scene or embarrassing anyone. "Are you feeling better now?" George asked quietly, sounding very much like the concerned child he was. The guard nodded gratefully. The few moments out of the sun and the relief of not having to stand perfectly still had helped enormously. "Much better, thanks to you. But I need to get back before anyone notices I'm gone." George peeked around the corner at the ceremony, which was continuing smoothly. "The other guards covered for you," he observed. They moved slightly to close the gap where you were standing. The guard was impressed by the boy's attention to detail. Most people wouldn't have noticed such a subtle adjustment in the formation. "You've got a good eye for military matters, young man. Have you been studying this stuff?" Before George could answer, they both heard footsteps approaching. Someone was coming, and George's adventure was about to take an unexpected turn. The footsteps belonged to Sergeant Major Williams, a veteran of 30 years with the Queen's Guard who had eyes like a hawk and missed nothing. He had noticed one of his men step out of formation and had come to investigate. As he rounded the corner into the small alcove, he found Guard Thompson standing with a young boy, both looking rather guilty. "Thompson, what exactly is going on here?" Sergeant Major Williams demanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. His eyes quickly took in the scene, his guard looking pale and shaky, the orange traffic cone, and the boy who seemed far too calm for someone who had just been caught in a restricted area. Guard Thompson straightened up as much as his queasy stomach would allow. "Sir, I was feeling unwell, and this young lad here helped me step away before I collapsed during the ceremony. He used proper military signals, sir." The sergeant major's eyebrows shot up. "Military signals? From a child?" He looked more carefully at the boy, taking in his neat appearance and confident posture. Something about the child seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "Is that so?" Williams said, studying George intently. "And what might your name be, young man?" George hesitated for just a moment. He knew that once he revealed who he was, everything would change. There would be phone calls and meetings and probably a very serious conversation with his parents. But he also knew that lying to a sergeant major was not an option. "George," he said simply, hoping that would be enough. "George what?" the sergeant major pressed, though something in his expression suggested he was beginning to suspect the truth. "George Wales," the boy admitted quietly, using the family name his father had used before becoming Prince of Wales. The color drained from Sergeant Major Williams' face so quickly that for a moment, George worried he might need help too. The military man's eyes went wide as he finally recognized the child standing before him. This wasn't just any boy who had wandered into a restricted area. This was Prince George, third in line to the throne, grandson of the king. "Your Royal Highness," William said, immediately snapping to attention and offering a proper salute. Guard Thompson, despite still feeling unwell, also straightened and saluted. "Please don't do that," George said quickly, looking around nervously. "Nobody knows I'm here. I'm supposed to be in lessons." The sergeant major's mind raced through the implications. The prince had somehow escaped his security detail and wandered into a public ceremony. This was exactly the kind of situation that caused security chiefs to have nightmares. But instead of causing problems, the young prince had actually prevented a potential incident by helping a guard who was about to collapse. "Sir, if I may." Guard Thompson spoke up, his voice still weak but determined. "The prince saved me from collapsing in front of hundreds of people. He knew exactly what to do and how to help me without causing a scene. His actions were, well, they were remarkable, sir." Sergeant Major Williams looked between the sick guard and the 8-year-old prince who had somehow managed to execute a perfect military rescue operation. In all his years of service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. "Your Royal Highness," he said carefully, "what you did was very brave and very kind, but I'm sure you understand that there are people who are probably very worried about where you are right now." George nodded, looking suddenly very young again. "I know I'm in trouble. I just wanted to see the ceremony up close, and when I saw him looking sick, I couldn't just let him fall." The sergeant major found himself in an impossible position. Protocol demanded that he immediately contact the prince's security team and probably half the palace staff. But looking at this boy who had shown such maturity and compassion, he felt there might be a better way to handle the situation. "Thompson," he said to his guard, "how are you feeling now?" "Much better, sir. I think I can return to duty." "Good. But I want you to report to the medical officer after the ceremony. No arguments." He turned back to George. "Your Royal Highness, I'm going to have to escort you back to the castle. But first, I want you to know that what you did today was exactly what a future leader should do. You saw someone in need and you helped them, even at risk to yourself." George felt a warm glow at the praise, but he was still worried about the trouble he was about to face. "Will Guard Thompson get in trouble because of me?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," the sergeant major replied firmly. "He was ill and you helped him handle it properly. That's what we call good soldiering." As they prepared to leave the alcove, the sergeant major realized that this incident was going to require some very careful handling. The story of how an 8-year-old prince had saved a royal guard from embarrassment would eventually become legend within the military, but it would need to be managed very carefully to protect both the prince's privacy and the reputation of the guard. The walk back to the castle felt like the longest journey of George's young life. Sergeant Major Williams walked beside him, not saying much, but George could feel the weight of what had happened settling around them both. The ceremony was still continuing behind them, tourists still taking photos, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. As they approached the main entrance to the castle, George could see figures hurrying about in the distance. Word was already spreading that the prince was missing from his lessons. His tutor had probably discovered his empty chair by now, and the carefully orchestrated panic that always followed when a royal child went unaccounted for was beginning. "Your Royal Highness," Sergeant Major Williams said quietly as they paused before entering the castle. "Before we go in there, I want you to know something. In all my years of service, I've seen many acts of bravery. What you did today, thinking quickly, acting with compassion, and putting someone else's welfare before your own safety, that's the mark of true leadership." George looked up at the tall military man. "But I broke the rules. I wasn't supposed to leave my lessons. Sometimes, William said with a slight smile. The most important rules aren't written down anywhere. The rule about helping someone in need, about protecting people's dignity, about doing the right thing even when it's difficult. Those are the rules that really matter. As they entered the castle, they were immediately met by a whirlwind of activity. George's personal protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell, appeared first, her face showing relief mixed with professional concern. Behind her came Ms. Henderson, George's private tutor, looking flustered and worried. "Your Royal Highness," Ms. Henderson exclaimed. "Where on earth have you been? We've been searching everywhere." Before George could answer, Sergeant Major Williams stepped forward. "Ma'am, if I may, His Royal Highness was with me. There was a small incident during the ceremony that required his assistance." Detective Inspector Mitchell's trained eye immediately picked up on the careful way the Sergeant Major was choosing his words. "What kind of incident?" Williams looked down at George, who gave him a small nod of permission. "One of my guards became unwell during the ceremony. The prince noticed and helped prevent what could have been a serious situation. His actions were completely appropriate and showed remarkable judgment." Ms. Henderson blinked in surprise. This wasn't the explanation she had been expecting. "George helped with a military situation?" "He did indeed," Williams confirmed. His knowledge of proper procedures and his quick thinking prevented an incident that could have been quite embarrassing for everyone involved. Detective Inspector Mitchell was studying both the Sergeant Major and George carefully. She knew there was more to this story than was being said, but she also recognized that Williams was a man she could trust. If he said the prince had handled himself well, then that was probably exactly what had happened. "I see," she said finally. "And is the guard in question all right now?" "He is, ma'am. He's returned to duty and will be checked by our medical officer after the ceremony concludes." George had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. The Sergeant Major was protecting him, making it sound like he had been where he was supposed to be instead of admitting that the prince had escaped from his lessons. It was a kindness that George would never forget. "Well," Ms. Henderson said, still looking confused, "I suppose if George was helping with official duties, that's quite different from what I thought had happened." "Your Royal Highness," Detective Inspector Mitchell said, addressing George directly, "in the future, if you need to leave your scheduled activities for any reason, please make sure to inform someone first. We need to know where you are at all times." George nodded solemnly. "I understand. I'm sorry I worried everyone." As the group began to disperse, Sergeant Major Williams caught George's eye one more time. "Your Royal Highness, if you ever wish to learn more about military procedures and protocols, I would be honored to arrange some proper instruction for you." "You clearly have an aptitude for it." George's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Really, you'd do that?" "It would be my privilege, sir. A future king should understand how his military operates." As Sergeant Major Williams walked away, George felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved that he wasn't in terrible trouble, grateful for the Sergeant Major's kindness, and proud that he had been able to help guard Thompson. But most of all, he felt like he had learned something important about what it really meant to be royal. Ms. Henderson was already talking about getting back to French vocabulary, but George's mind was still on the ceremony, on the sick guard, and on the moment when he had decided to act instead of just watching. It had been scary, but it had also felt important in a way that conjugating verbs never could. 2 years have passed since that morning when Prince George slipped away from his French lessons and changed everything. Now 10 years old, he sits in the same reception room where he received his honorary military badge. But this time he's not alone. Guard Thompson, now promoted to Corporal Thompson, sits across from him, and between them lies a chessboard. "Your move, Junior Colonel," Thompson says with a smile, using the honorary title that George has grown to love. George studies the board carefully. Thompson has been teaching him chess as part of their regular military strategy sessions, and the boy has proven to be a quick learner. But George's mind isn't entirely on the game today. Tomorrow marks the 2nd anniversary of their first meeting, and the Queen's Guard is planning a special ceremony to commemorate it. "Thompson," George says, moving his knight, "do you ever regret what happened that day?" Thompson looks surprised by the question. "Regret it? Your Royal Highness, that day changed my entire life for the better. Why would I regret it? Well, everyone knows the story now, about how you got sick during the ceremony. Isn't that embarrassing?" Thompson considers this seriously before answering. Over the past 2 years, he has indeed become something of a legend within the military community. The story of the guard who was saved by an 8-year-old prince has been told and retold, growing slightly more dramatic with each telling. But rather than embarrassment, it has brought him respect. Your Royal Highness, let me tell you something I've learned in these 2 years. The story people tell isn't about a guard who got sick. It's about a young prince who saw someone in trouble and risked everything to help them. It's about leadership and compassion and doing the right thing even when no one is watching. George moves another piece on the chessboard, but he's clearly more interested in the conversation than the game. The other guards, do they treat you differently now? They do, Thompson admits, but not because they think less of me. They treat me differently because they know I was there when their future king showed who he really is. They ask me to tell them about that day, about what you were like, about how you handled the situation. You've become something of a legend yourself, sir. Through the window, they can see preparations underway for tomorrow's ceremony. It won't be a public event. The royal family has decided that some stories are better kept within the military community. But for the Queen's Guard, it will be a chance to officially recognize both the prince's actions and the bond that has developed between the royal family and the soldiers who serve them. George has grown and changed significantly in these 2 years. His honorary position with the Queen's Guard has given him regular contact with military life, and it shows in his bearing and confidence. He still takes his regular lessons, still studies French vocabulary with Ms. Henderson, but now he also spends time learning about leadership, strategy, and the responsibilities that come with commanding others' loyalty. Sir, Thompson says, making his own move on the chessboard, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you remember what you were thinking in that moment when you decided to help me? What made you act instead of just watching? George is quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I remember thinking that being royal meant I should be able to help people, not just watch them struggle. I thought about all the stories I'd heard about kings and queens who were remembered for protecting their people, and I wanted to be that kind of person. And are you? That kind of person, I mean. George looks up from the chessboard and smiles. I'm trying to be. Every day I'm trying to be. As if summoned by their conversation, Sergeant Major Williams appears in the doorway. He's been promoted to Regimental Sergeant Major now, partly due to his skillful handling of the situation 2 years ago. Junior Colonel, Corporal Thompson, he says with the formal tone they all maintain during official interactions. I wanted to review the ceremony plans for tomorrow and get your approval for the final arrangements. George straightens in his chair, unconsciously adopting the military bearing he has learned over the past 2 years. Please proceed, Regimental Sergeant Major. As Williams outlines the ceremony, which will include the presentation of a special commendation to George and official recognition of Thompson's service, George feels a deep sense of satisfaction. Tomorrow will mark not just the anniversary of one morning's adventure, but the beginning of what he hopes will be a lifetime of service, the chess game forgotten for the moment. The three of them work through the ceremony details. Outside, the preparations continue, and tourists walking by the castle gates have no idea that inside, a future king is learning the most important lesson of leadership, that true authority comes not from commanding others, but from earning their respect through service and sacrifice. When the planning session ends and Thompson and Williams take their leave, George returns to the window. The setting sun casts the same long shadows across the courtyard that he remembers from that morning 2 years ago. But everything else has changed. He has changed. Tomorrow's ceremony will be special. But George knows that the real celebration is in the relationships he has built, the lessons he has learned, and the man he is becoming. The 8-year-old boy who slipped away from his French lessons to watch a ceremony has become a 10-year-old leader who understands that sometimes the most important lessons can't be found in any textbook. And somewhere in the guards' quarters, Corporal Thompson is probably telling the story one more time to new recruits, reminding them that leadership can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest acts of service happen when no one is watching, except for one small boy with a good heart and the courage to act on it. 3 days later, George was back in his regular routine of lessons and royal duties when an unexpected visitor arrived at the castle. Guard Thompson, now fully recovered and back to his normal duties, had requested a private audience with the young prince. Such requests were unusual, but given the circumstances of their meeting, it had been approved. George found himself in one of the castle's smaller reception rooms, feeling nervous as he waited. He had wondered several times over the past few days whether he had done the right thing, and whether the guard was really okay. When Thompson entered, still impressive in his red uniform but somehow more human without the tall bearskin hat, George felt a wave of relief. "Your Royal Highness," Thompson said, offering a proper bow. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did, and I brought you something." From behind his back, Thompson produced a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in red velvet, was a military insignia, the badge of the Queen's Guard, polished to a brilliant shine. "This belonged to my grandfather," Thompson explained. "He served in the Queen's Guard for 25 years. I was going to give it to my son when he's old enough, but I think you've earned it more than anyone." George stared at the badge in amazement. He had seen similar insignia on uniforms and in museums, but holding one felt different. It felt like holding a piece of history, a symbol of all the brave men and women who had served the crown. "I can't take something that belongs to your family," George said, though he clearly wanted to accept the gift. "You saved my honor." "Your Royal Highness," Thompson said firmly, "do you know what would have happened if I had collapsed during that ceremony? The newspapers would have had a field day. Guard faints at royal ceremony would have been headlines around the world. My children would have been embarrassed, my regiment would have been embarrassed, and I would never have lived it down." George had not really thought about all these consequences. In his mind, he had simply seen someone who needed help and had found a way to provide it. "But more than that," Thompson continued, "you showed me what real leadership looks like. You saw a problem, you found a solution, and you acted on it without thinking about what it might cost you. That's exactly the kind of person I want to serve." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Sergeant Major Williams entered, accompanied by someone George recognized but had never met personally, Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer of the entire Queen's Guard Regiment. "Your Royal Highness," Colonel Harrison said, "I hope we're not interrupting, but I wanted to speak with you about what happened during the ceremony." George felt his stomach tighten. Was he in trouble after all? Had someone decided that his actions were inappropriate? Colonel Harrison seemed to sense his worry. "Please don't look so concerned, sir. You're not in any trouble. In fact, quite the opposite. Word of what you did has spread through the military community, and I've been asked by several senior officers to commend you personally." "Commend me?" George asked, not entirely sure what that meant. "What you did showed exceptional judgment and character," the colonel explained. "You identified a potential problem, developed a solution that would protect everyone involved, and executed it flawlessly. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in our officers." Sergeant Major Williams stepped forward. "With your parents' permission, Your Royal Highness, we would like to offer you an honorary position as a junior colonel of the Queen's Guard. It would be largely ceremonial at your age, but it would give you opportunities to learn more about military life and leadership." George's eyes widened. An honorary military position? At 8 years old? It seemed incredible. "What would that mean exactly?" he asked. "It would mean you could visit the regiment regularly, learn about military traditions and procedures, and perhaps most importantly, it would mean that men like Guard Thompson here would know that their future king truly understands their service." Guard Thompson nodded enthusiastically. "It would be an honor to serve under your command, sir. Even an honorary one." George looked around the room at these 3 military men who had come to honor him for doing what he thought was simply the right thing. He felt overwhelmed by their respect and kindness, but also proud in a way he had never experienced before. "I would like that very much," he said finally. "But I have one condition." The 3 men looked surprised. An 8-year-old prince making conditions? "I want Guard Thompson to be the one to teach me about the day-to-day life of the soldiers. He knows what it's really like, and I want to learn from him." Thompson's face broke into a huge grin. "It would be my absolute privilege, Your Royal Highness." As the meeting concluded and the men prepared to leave, Colonel Harrison turned back to George. "Your Royal Highness, I've been in the military for 30 years and I've served under many leaders. What you did the other day, seeing a problem and fixing it quietly, protecting someone's dignity, putting duty above your own comfort, that's the kind of leadership that inspires true loyalty." After they left, George sat alone in the reception room, holding the military badge Thompson had given him. 3 days ago, he had been a boy sneaking away from French lessons. Now he was an honorary junior colonel who had earned the respect of some of the most experienced soldiers in the country. It felt like a dream, but the weight of the badge in his hands reminded him it was all very real.